All right. Well, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. Today I'm joined by former NASA astronaut Richard Hieb. Richard has logged more than 750 hours in space and more than 17 hours conducting spacewalks. After NASA, he worked 20 years in the private industry as an aerospace executive involved in nearly every aspect of spaceflight. And today he is a scholar and residence instructor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. So, Richard, thanks for coming on today.
You bet. And feel free to call me Rick. That's what most folks do.
Perfect. So, Rick, when did you first get interested in becoming an astronaut?
I never remember not being interested in becoming an astronaut.
Okay.
I'm told, I don't really remember it, but I'm told by people that knew me, like in first grade, that say, oh yeah, you wanted to be an astronaut even then. I don't remember that, but I'm sure they're right, because like I said, I can't remember not wanting to be.
So, like when you were thinking about being an astronaut as a child, what would you do? Were you like constantly trying to find news articles about, astronauts or?
Well, so the rest of the story is that in about maybe first grade, maybe second grade, a teacher sent a note home to my mom, because in those days that's what you did, and it said, little Ricky needs to get glasses. His eyes are not adequate. So I went off to get glasses, and from that point on, I stopped thinking about being an astronaut, because in those days, to be an astronaut, you had to be a pilot. To be a pilot, 20/20 vision, and I was nowhere close to that and was never going to get there. So really, I stopped thinking about being an astronaut and just thought what an awesome job that would be, right on up till 15 years later or so with the shuttle program, when they invented mission specialists.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So, wow. So it sounds like then growing up, I mean, in college, did you have any idea that you could become an astronaut? I mean, how much was the industry changing at that point?
No, I mean, I always had the love for the business, but I grew up in a little town in North Dakota.
Yeah.
And we didn't really, my folks were not professional people. And there was really no foreseeable path that really, I couldn't even figure out how you'd go to work for NASA. And so I went to undergrad school and got a physics and math degree. And then I went to grad school and I started in the physics program at CU. And I still had no thoughts about ever really becoming an astronaut or anything, because still the requirement for mission specialists, the vision requirement still was too stringent for me to consider applying. So, went there, started in physics, and as anybody that's got a physics advanced degree will tell you, it's really hard. And I was working really hard, and I started saying, well, why am I doing this exactly? I mean, it's a little bit embarrassing to admit, but I didn't really have a plan like a lot of people do. I was kind of following what was, for me, sort of the path of least resistance, or the path that felt like fun. So I went over to the aerospace engineering department, because I said, what I really always wanted to do was somehow be in the aerospace industry. And so I went over, asked for admission, they admitted me to the master's program. And in between years of graduate school, or really during my first year there in the physics program, I saw a little thing hanging from the wall in the physics building, Duane Physics Building there in Boulder. And it said, summer jobs at NASA. I thought, what? Really? They have summer jobs? Now it's commonplace for young people to, almost required really for young people to be a co-op or a summer intern or both. In those days, it was still a little bit rare. And I thought, wow, that would be pretty amazing. Instead of working at the truck stop where I'd worked in high school, or, any of those jobs, to actually work at NASA. And I got the thing down and looked at it, and the application was due like in a day or something. And I thought,
Wow.
oh, that's impossible. But I went to the post office, because that's what you did then to get the big government SF 240A or whatever form it was, big long green thing that folded out multiple times. And it's like, oh my gosh. But I started dutifully filling it out, and quickly got to sections like special skills, special knowledge, of which I had none, at least in my mind. And I didn't really think to myself, well, Rick, you're competing with other people your age. Nobody has those things. But I was
Right.
sort of, taken aback by that. And honestly, somewhere like I can't really recommend this to others, but I started, having a little bit of fun and putting down special skills like, well, I knew quite a few card tricks. So I put down, 12 card tricks I can do. I could stand on my head. There were a number of those things that were, special skills, but not really relevant.
Right.
But I was just kind of having fun. And, to cut to the chase, some weeks after I submitted, I got a phone call from this guy who was speaking Texan. And I really couldn't understand him. I mean, it was wah, 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 this southern drawl. And my landlady had knocked on the door and said, you got a call. So I'd been in the shower. So I'm standing there freezing with a towel on me, talking to this guy, trying to understand Texan. Eventually, I sort of understand that he's talking about this summer job. And pretty soon he's describing the job. And understand, I'm still in the physics department. My engineering knowledge at this point is like, you put it on the head of a pin with a magic marker. And he's describing an engineering job. And I'm embarrassingly saying, sir, I don't really understand it. And after he explained it about 3 times, I said, well, sir, I can't say I truly understand the job, but it really doesn't matter. I would do any job that you have there. I would love to come do any job. So we hang up and I'm like, oh, what a disaster. There's just no chance. And a couple of weeks later, I get an offer letter in the mail. Come to work at Johnson Space Center, summer intern. Years later, I found out that actually that particular boss went through like 400 different applications.
Oh my gosh.
And the reason he picked me, he picked 2 of us. I don't know why he picked the other guy, but he picked me partly because he enjoyed reading my application. Now, to be fair, I had the, sort of required credentials. I had
Right.
great grades from school and great grades from undergrad school and good scores on GREs and, SATs and all that kind of stuff. So, on paper, all that worked, but really what made me stand out to him was I looked like a person and not like I'd had my parents, my engineering parents fill out the form for me or something.
Right. Yeah.
So that led to a summer job at Johnson Space Center, which was fantastic. I loved it. And then I went back to grad school, and still, I wasn't really thinking about ever becoming an astronaut because, like I said, I didn't meet the requirements. I met a few because they were brand new. That was the summer that the class of '78 showed up at Johnson Space Center. So I met a few, brand new astronauts, got a chance to chat with them and thought, well, they seem like human beings. They have a lot of great attributes. They've done a lot of things, but, they do seem to, put one foot in front of the other when they walk. And so I was not quite so, overwhelmed with the idea of astronauts, but went to back to school in Boulder, finished my master's, called up my old boss down there at Johnson and said, hey, is there any chance of me actually getting a full-time job there? And he said, well, right now, this was 1979. He said, the shuttle is pretty much designed. And so engineering really isn't staffing anymore. We're kind of going the other direction. He said, but the ops side of the house really is staffing up. And, if you'd be interested, I could, send your stuff over to the guys in the ops side. And I said, absolutely. And so sure enough, they were staffing. And I got a call a little bit later that said, hey, we want to, interview you and take this a little further. And so to cut that story short, I did get a full-time job at Johnson Space Center, then coming out of grad school and went to work at JSC. And, I loved what I was doing. Can't say I love the climate. Anybody that's been to Houston, if you love the climate, you're one in a million people.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty hot.
But the people there are fantastic and the work is fantastic. And, Johnson Space Center was a fabulous place to be.
Yeah. So at what point in your career then at NASA did you start to think about like, hey, I can, try out and try to become an actual astronaut here?
So I went to work in 79 there as an engineer, worked the first shuttle flight, was having a lot of fun. And I think probably in 1983, for the third class of sort of shuttle astronauts, they said, do we really need the mission specialist vision to be, as good as we're requiring it? I mean, yeah, the pilots, you want them to have that kind of vision because, an emergency situation, they got to be flying, but really mission specialists, maybe it doesn't need to be so strict. So they opened up the requirement to whatever it was they opened it to, and I don't remember, but when they did, I was like, wow, I think I'm pretty close to that number. And I thought, by this time I'm an adult. So I'm like, no, there's no chance. They had 8,000 applicants in 1978. I don't know if you've seen recently, now it's more like 30,000.
Yeah, it's pretty insane. Yeah.
But I thought, if you don't apply, that's the one way to be sure you'll never get selected. So I thought, yeah, I think I will. So I did the things to put in my application. I always tell people that think that they might want to be an astronaut, particularly nowadays, of course, it'd be if you wanted to be a NASA astronaut. If you want to do it another way, go make billions of dollars and build your own spaceships, that's a new other way to go there. But if you want to be a NASA astronaut, I tell people, go to Johnson Space Center, get a job there. Because the truth is, most of the people that matter in the selection process are there.
Yeah.
And if you're on the selection committee, you've got two people, one of whom has great credentials, but you know nothing about them. Another one who has great credentials and you've seen their work and you know what kind of person they are. Well, that's kind of an easy choice.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that's the good part of being there. The bad part is I got a phone call from the guy that ran the selection process sort of administratively. And he said, "Hey, Rick, we've seen your glasses. We don't think you can see 20/50 or whatever the requirement is. Before we even look at your application, you're going to have to go to the eye doctor, have them test your eyes and give us that little form filled out before we even consider it, because we don't want to go through this process and waste everybody's time." So I got actually a special consideration for my eyes in the wrong direction because I was local there. But I went to the eye doctor, exactly met the requirement, which of course it's one of those many things that's pass fail. And so they accepted my application. We went through the process. I got interviewed that year, which is kind of in my mind was in a way my goal. Of course, I wanted to be selected, but to be interviewed means that at least on paper, they think you're qualified.
Right. Yeah.
And in those days, I'm not sure what the current process is. They would interview 6 groups of 20 over a period of 8 or 9 weeks so that they could do some other things in between. And I got interviewed, but I didn't get selected. And one of my office mates said, "Well, did you ask them how you did?" And I know I sound naive when I say this, but I'm like, you think they'll tell me? And she said, "Rick, it's the government. Of course they'll tell you. That's what they do. They fill out forms and, do stuff." So I called up the guy that ran the process again and said, "Hey, Dwayne, can you tell me how I did?" And he said, "Sure, we'll send you a letter." So they did. And my particular category I was in was general engineering. And if I remember right, they said they had interviewed 23 or 21 in that category. They'd selected 2, and I was number 3.
Oh,
So it
wow.
was one of those, you got so close,
Yeah.
but not close enough. And so they actually, for the only time that I remember, they might have done it since, but for the first time then and for a long time, they did another selection immediately the next year. And so, of course, I kept my application live and I got selected that year in 1985. So that was how I got there.
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, I guess all the all the little requirements that you have to fill out, and how something just like, your vision can potentially keep you out. I guess today, if someone was trying to apply, they may need to get like laser eye surgery or something like that.
You can do that now. When I was
Yeah,
there, LASIK was kind of being invented by the
yeah,
Russians, where they were cutting the eyeball, sort of making the
yeah,
slashes. NASA didn't have a lot of confidence in that.
yeah,
And during the time of my flying, I could not have gotten any kind of LASIK. After I left the office, I actually did get LASIK, and now it's no longer a disqualifying, procedure. If you've got LASIK, it's okay.
yeah.
But yeah, in those days, it was still being invented, and I was following it very closely because I really, really wanted to get up in the morning and not have to put glasses on.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Um, so t- describe the training for, someone who's been selected as an astronaut. What is that like? What do you have to do?
So in many ways, I look back on that as, especially the beginning of it, as being in some ways the most fun. Of course, flying in space is the most fun. But the thing I loved about the training is that it's very diverse. You get a little bit of every kind of science. Of course, you spend a lot of time in the simulators. I had a bit of an advantage, as did some of the other people coming from mission operations who were selected with me, because to do my job as a flight controller, I took a lot of the training that astronauts did. They had part task trainers, which were little shuttle cockpits, and one would have some of the systems well mocked up. Another one would have different systems mocked up. As part of my training to be a flight controller, I would go over and do exactly the same classes on operating the maneuvering system or the computers or the APUs, all those kind of things. We do the exact same training that the crew did. So a lot of that was, familiar to me. But then on the other hand, compared to the military guys and women, there was things I had no experience with, like flying around in high performance airplanes, parachute training. We didn't jump out of an airplane, but we did water landing training where they would pull you behind a big jet boat with a paraglider, basically, and you rise up to about 500 feet. And then you'd hit the handles to release from the boat and drop down in the water and go through the procedures that you would need to do getting out of an airplane. And similarly, we did land survival training up in Oklahoma, where they would pull you behind a truck to do the same thing, to get you up to speed, to get you
Wow.
up, and then you hit the cords to release and drop down and show that you, not break your leg, hopefully, by doing an appropriate parachute landing fall where you sort of hit and roll a little bit to take the energy out. Scuba diving, they take you through that training. I was scuba certified, so for me it was refresher, but you're going to spend a lot of time in the water tank. Now, when you're in a spacesuit, of course, you don't really need scuba training, but you'll also spend time in the water tank observing other folks doing, runs that they're going to do now on station, what we would have done on shuttle. So you're going to get scuba certified. And some years ago, I read a book, trying to remember it, Undaunted Courage, I think it was, about Lewis and Clark. And here's a funny parallel. I was reading the book, and I always thought it was Lewis and Clark, but really it was Lewis, who was Jefferson's secretary. And Jefferson said, I want you to go do this thing where you're going to go out and explore this territory that we purchased. And he sent him off to Philadelphia, which is where at that time the leading scientists in the US were sort of congregated in the Philadelphia area. And Lewis went through a lot of the same analog training that astronauts do. He learned a
Wow.
little botany, a little biology, a little ornithology, volcanology, geology, all of those things. And I thought when I read it, it's like, wow, astronaut training before there were astronauts.
Yeah, pretty much.
But very, very similar sort of thing. And like I say, I love that part. I'm one of those people that I don't like to repeat myself. I like to do different things. And if you looked at my entire career, that would be obvious.
Yeah.
And that's what's fun for me. I'm not great at repetition, and we'll probably talk some more about some of these things later, but if you kind of skip to the end of my flying career as an astronaut, what happened was one day I got called to go to the simulator and be an astronaut. And there's sort of two things about simulator training. Sometimes it's about training the crew members, and sometimes they want a crew in the simulator more so that there's a crew there doing crew things while the ground folks, the flight controllers, are really being trained. So they'll tell the crew, don't solve this problem yet, Rick. I know you know how to do this, but don't do it. Let the flight controllers tell you what to do. And
Okay.
when I was a baby astronaut, I was like, I didn't care. 8 to midnight sim, put me in there. Yeah, I can't wait to go over there. It's just so much fun. 10 years later, they call you up and say, hey, Rick, we've got an 8 to midnight sim and we need you to go over and be a whatever. And I'm like, oh boy, 8 to midnight in the simulator. And the day I thought that, I thought, oh my gosh, it's time to leave.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of people in line to be astronauts that can't wait to get in the simulator, just like you couldn't wait to get in the simulator. Time to get out of the way and let them have that fun.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. It's, I guess, over time, you just kind of get used to things and you lose interest. Yeah. So let's see. Can you talk about your first mission in space then? Like the first time you went up, and what was that like?
Yeah, well, so STS-39, it was the first, maybe one of the only, if not the only, unclassified DoD mission. It was unclassified in the sense that all of our orbital parameters were well known, and altitudes, and really even what all our payloads were well known. What was kept classified was the data that we collected. And this was in the early days of Star Wars, as under Reagan. And what the objective was to be able to use devices, telescopes, ground and space-based, to see maneuvering bodies in space and know what they are and be able to develop the algorithms to go intercept those, missiles that are bad guys coming at you. And the problem is there's no vacuum chamber on Earth big enough to fire rocket engines and see how they actually behave in the vacuum of space. And so our mission was really about collecting both infrared and UV and invisible imagery of rocket plumes in space, and collect that data, bring it back, hand it off to the scientists so they could develop the algorithms. And I was particularly responsible for sort of half of the payload bay, a device, a satellite called the IBSS, the Infrared Background Signature Survey. And it was a spacecraft that we were going to deploy with a big robot arm, fly away from it, and then command it to look back at us, and then turn the instruments on at various times where we fired various combinations of our thrusters. And then after a day and a half to go back, collect that satellite, grab it, stick it in the payload bay, bring it home, and let them analyze the data. This is one of the cases where NASA actually assigned a crew member for a very specific reason, namely, as a flight operator, my specialty was rendezvous and proximity operations. And I had worked on developing the procedures for the shuttle to do rendezvous and fly up close and maneuver around another vehicle as part of my technical job as an engineer. So I was really familiar with that stuff. And on top of that, the actual spacecraft that we flew had flown before in a different configuration as the very first test of flying near a vehicle, and I had helped write those procedures to fly around that particular thing. So I was very familiar with the payload, with how you do business, with the Germans who built the satellite bus, actually. I knew all those people, and so they assigned me to the mission well ahead of anybody else that was working on that part of the mission, to basically work with the procedures writers to develop the things to let us do the mission we planned to do.
Yeah.
So it was fantastic for me because it was exactly in my wheelhouse. I knew the stuff. And I had spent a lot of time in the simulator practicing rendezvous proximity operations. And while I was in there, I had on my own sort of learned how to operate the robot arm as an engineer. So I was way ahead of the training for operating the arm. So like a dream come true for me to go in space and do some of the same things I'd been doing as an engineer. So that's what we were going to do when we got up there. Now, of course, when you strap into the vehicle, no
Yeah.
matter how much training you've had, that's all new. And, you know, the simulators are actually pretty darn good at giving you the right feel for what it's like to go launch in space. The vibratory environment, acoustics, all that stuff. It's actually pretty good. And sort of the downside is if you're a mission specialist without a flight deck responsibility, and that mission, I didn't have flight deck responsibility on the launch, you're kind of sitting down there with not a heck of a lot to do. So your brain is allowed to go to too many places that you really don't want it to go.
Interesting.
You're thinking about all the disaster scenarios and what you're going to do, because remember, we had, the Challenger happened shortly after I came aboard as an astronaut. And so what had been sort of theoretical before was now a real possibility.
Yeah.
And you can't help but think of those things. And when I applied to be an astronaut the first time, I was single. By this time, I was married and with 2 babies.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So the stakes had changed dramatically for me personally from, not that no one would care if something happened to me. People would care, but it's totally different when you have a family depending on you. And so all those thoughts go through your head. And, the first 2 minutes when the solid rocket motors are burning is a pretty rough ride. You are shaking around a lot. And one of the rocket motor engineers explained it to me as the fact that, the inside of that big solid rocket motor is basically hollow. And when they light it up, the whole inside of it lights up at once. And as it's burning, really pieces of it are falling out, and they fall down through the chamber, and on their way out of the rocket, they briefly, ever so briefly, might change the pressure required for the exhaust plume to get out of the rocket, because they're kind of clogging it up a little bit and getting blasted out. And so you have this constant stream of stuff sort of temporarily blocking up the exhaust nozzle, and you're shaking around because it's doing that stuff as it's blowing around the back end. So it's a pretty rough ride for the first couple of minutes. You'd be hard put to take notes. And even though this is supposed to happen, if you're not a little afraid, is when people ask me, when I speak publicly, they say, well, are you scared when you're in the launch pad? I always say, if you're not scared, you need to go back and get more training.
Yeah.
You really don't understand what's going on if you're not afraid during the launch.
Yeah.
Not like, kind of afraid, but just you need to have a healthy respect for what's going on. That's about 2 minutes with the shuttle. And then the solids finish their job and come off. And all 3 of my missions, even though I knew it was coming, even though I'd experienced it, the huge change in thrust from the solid rocket motors, which together put out over 5 million pounds of thrust, to the liquid fueled engines, which together max out at about 1.5 million pounds of thrust. And all of a sudden you've gone from this huge vibration to absolutely smooth, because the liquid engines are super smooth. Your first thought is, oh crap, everything shut off. And then you're like, no, I still feel myself. I'm being pressed into my seat. Yeah, they're still good. We're still accelerating. And, and you're not hearing the commander saying scary things from the flight deck.
Right.
And so, you go through this quick thing of, and then, oh yeah, we're good. So the next 6 minutes on the liquids is, like I say, it is a absolutely smooth ride. My third flight, and I had heard people talk about this in previous missions, and I was glad I had, depending on what we had in the payload bay, you might sometimes get about a 0.5 hertz vibration that would be kind of a wah, sound that you would hear coming out of the payload bay or the whole vehicle. And it's a disconcerting sound. And I was really glad that other people that experienced it, and I could say, yeah, this is not, I don't like it, but it's not scary. It's just how this particular payload is mounted in the payload bay has, changed the modes of the whole thing. And so, that part goes on for about 6 more minutes, and then the engine shut off, and then you're in space. And
Yeah.
I don't care how many degrees you have, you're just like, I want something to float in front of me to watch it float, because yeah, it actually floats.
Yeah.
The kind of funny thing is, you don't, at least for me, I didn't really feel like I was floating right away, because you're in your pressure suit, which is sort of pushing on you everywhere, and you're strapped into your seat, and you're still attached to your parachute. You got all this stuff on you, and you're getting a lot of sensations from your whole body. And so you don't get, like that lurch in your stomach when you're driving a car and you go over a big bump and, your stomach goes, woo, and, it's, oh, do it again.
Right.
You don't get that, at least I never did. It's just this transition to, things are floating. And then you unstrap and do all the things you need to do to get out of your seat. And kind of a universal feeling that people have is that they're being pushed toward the ceiling. And we sort of speculate that that's because you're no longer being pulled toward the floor. And so your sense is, well, if I'm not being pulled toward the floor, I must be being pushed toward the ceiling. I don't know if that's really true, but I had that same sensation, and many people did. But, the first thing I did once I got out of my seat and floated up to the flight deck, still in my flight suit. So I, big old pressure suit, squeezing up into the flight deck with everybody else. Of course, to look out the window as soon as the payload bay doors are open and look at Earth. And my first comment was, oh my gosh, it's the blue planet.
Yeah.
And I meant that two ways. The IMAX movie, The Blue Planet, had just come out. And I think we even got a chance to see the premiere in Washington. And it is super accurate. The IMAX movies seen on a big screen, really any large format camera on a big screen, is really exactly what it looks like out the window. I mean, it's just right. And part of the reason it's just right is when you go to one of those IMAX shows, you're looking at this big rectangular thing, but there are edges to it. And it's that way when you look out the window too. When you look out the window, you can't shove your head through the window.
Right.
So your peripheral vision always notes that you're looking through this frame. And so again, the IMAX movies on the big screen replicate that very, very well. The other reason I said, oh my gosh, it's the blue planet, is that blue does dominate your whole experience looking out the window. I mean, yes, space is black, but so much of Earth is blue, and so many shades of blue that, that you just notice that and you can't help but see it. And
Yeah.
we'll talk about spacewalks in a little bit, and we'll talk about the difference in looking out of the helmet. But yeah, that was my first experience, and you never forget those things.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder what was it like for you then to go to sleep that first night in space and then wake up again to, was it kind of like this another incredible moment where you can't really believe that you're in space when you wake up?
Well, yeah, although you've hit on something that for me, I didn't sleep worth a darn.
Yeah.
Ever.
I figured that could be an issue. Yeah.
Ever. I had a total of 30 days in space, basically. And I don't think I ever had a night that I slept more than 4 or 5 hours. And, there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, there's adrenaline, but also you're not working very hard. So physically, you're not getting very tired.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you're going around the Earth every 90 minutes. So you get a sunrise and a sunset, every hour and a half. So you have no cues from light to tell you that it's time to go to bed. And then when you do actually go to bed, if you're somebody that, sort of sleeps in the same position every night, well, you're never going to have that feeling, because you don't sleep on your bed. You just sort of sleep next to your bed. And you strap your head to pillow and strap your body in and all this stuff. And believe me, you are not fooled into thinking you're in your bed. And
Right.
so what would usually happen to me would be I'd be tired. So I'd go to sleep for a couple hours, maybe 3, maybe 4. Then I'd wake up, look at my watch and be like, oh no, it's only like the equivalent of 1 in the morning. I need to sleep for 5 more hours. And then you start stressing about not sleeping and, am I going to be able to do my job tomorrow because I didn't get the sleep I need? And of course, then that doesn't help you sleep either.
No.
So, it's a mess for me. Now, the station folks tell me that, after you've been up there for a while, it's fantastic to sleep in space. But my longest mission was 2 weeks, and I never got a good night's sleep ever in 2 weeks. So,
Yeah.
I just couldn't wait to get up. I was like, I don't want to bother anybody else by getting out of bed too soon, but I'm really bored with just trying to sleep here in my sleeping bag.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, how long does it take to get used to the feeling of being in space in general and moving around and floating? And
Yeah, so I got sick on the first day, and you're kind of warned that you might. I didn't use the drug of choice these days is phenergan, which seems to work pretty well to prevent space sickness syndrome, whatever you want to call it. Basically, I decided not to take it in hopes that I'd be one of the people that wouldn't be affected. I was sort of in the middle of the road as far as that goes. I felt pretty crummy the first day, threw up one time, had my little bag handy. There really wasn't much to throw up because you haven't eaten anything for like 5 or 6 hours at this point. It felt a little bit like you feel when you have the flu and you throw up, you feel better afterwards for a little while, but you're still sick.
yeah,
I've been motion sick a time or two since then on boats. It was nothing like that. Anybody that's ever been motion sick on a boat, you're like, please, somebody put me out of my misery. This
yes,
is
I've had that
horrible.
experience. Yeah,
Okay, yeah. So
nightmare.
that's horrible. I
Yeah,
didn't have that. I just felt kind of bad. And the whole first day, I didn't feel great. Second
yeah,
day, I was good. Second mission, I felt a little bad the first day, but didn't get sick. Third mission, 0 symptoms. So my body clearly was, learning to accommodate, being in the space environment. But I think we felt pretty good, most of us, by the second, third day. We felt pretty good about, moving around. Again, you watch the space station astronauts, they're so much better at getting around than we are. It seems like they just like push with a finger and their body does exactly what they want it to do and they go right where they want it to go. We tended to flail a bit more, but it's a pretty small cockpit, so you're not going to flail very much. I mean, you're always near something that you can, reach out and touch and grab. So, I didn't feel like out of control, and it's just so much fun to be there that, who cares if you're a little bit out of control? That
sure. Yeah,
it's just as much fun in my mind. It's just as much fun as you think it would be. If you think floating space would be awesome, you're absolutely right. It's spectacular.
yeah. And what was it like eating and drinking in space?
I understand that way back when in history, there were some people that were like wondering whether or not the human body would be able to process food in 0 gravity. And I don't really understand that because I can't imagine that college students were any different then than they were when I went to school, where guys would be drinking beer while standing on their head. So I'm thinking if you can drink beer while standing on your head, anyway, eating and drinking, so it's pretty clear that you could do things upside down. That's minus 1G. So 0G shouldn't be a problem. And it really was not. One kind of funny thing that I learned after a couple of experiences, a lot of the vegetables are dehydrated, and we, stick them into a machine and squirt water into them and kind of mush it around with your thumbs. And number one, you want to wait to let the water be fully hydrated into the vegetables before you start eating there. It won't taste very good. 2, eat the vegetables before you eat the other stuff because they're never going to be awesome, rehydrated. And 3, they come in little pouches, which you kind of have to cut open with a scissors or something and eat with a spoon or a fork. One of the things that I discovered was that eating was almost required to be relaxing because you cannot eat vegetables that are in that kind of a container quickly, or they'll come off the spoon and start flying around. So you have to, kind of put it in, be deliberate, move to your mouth, kind of deliberate, eat kind of slowly. And so meals actually were quite relaxing. We did kind of a fun thing on my second and third flight, which was driven by something that happened on my first flight, which maybe it was day 3 or something. I was working in the middeck and my colleague, Lacey Veach, was sort of floating sideways. And he said, "Oh my gosh," he says, the floor is the ceiling, or the floor is a wall, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like, well, yeah, of course it is. You're floating sideways. But what I didn't get what he meant until later. I had a similar experience where it isn't just that the floor is sideways to you, it's that you have changed your perspective. And now literally this wall that your feet are pointed at feels like the floor.
Ah, okay.
Or you float upside down, and after 5 to 10 minutes, the ceiling feels like the floor. And actually, it's quite disconcerting because you now don't know where anything is, because
Oh
you've
my
never
gosh.
trained, with your feet pointed at the ceiling. And, in the shuttle middeck, for example, if you were facing, let's say, forward, or let's say you were facing aft, well, if you're on the ground with your feet pointed at the floor, the toilet's over your left shoulder. Well, now you're pointed at the ceiling, now it's over your right shoulder. And everything is new. And so my second flight, I insisted that, especially for the one rookie we had on that crew, we had to have a meal sitting on the ceiling, so with our feet sort of holding on to the ceiling so we'd stay there until everybody had this sort of transition in what's up and down.
Yeah.
And we were there. And so we did that, and we were part of the way through the meal. And the ground called up and said, "Hey, can somebody go to the flight deck and flip some switch?" I don't know what the switch was. And so Pierre Thuet was closest to the interdeck access ladder. And so he said, I'll do it. He said, but I'm going to keep my feet, pointed the same direction so I don't lose my sense of, which way is up and down. So he went to the ladder. If I'm not mistaken, his hands automatically pulled on the ladder, making his head go toward the floor.
Oh my gosh.
Initially, just because you've climbed that ladder hundreds and hundreds of times. And so your hands just do that. And he was like, oh, oops. And then he pushed himself to the flight deck, feet first. And a few minutes later, we hear, guys, you got to come up here, but keep your feet pointed toward the ceiling. Don't screw that up. You got to come up and see what it's like. So we all float up to the flight deck. And it was so strange because what we think of as the overhead windows, which feel up, are now down, and the earth is below you. And it felt just like being in a glass bottom boat. And it was this crazy different sort of experience. And it reminded me that no matter how much time I was up there, if I was floating with my feet toward the floor, earth always felt up, because generally we were pointed belly towards the earth.
Right.
That meant the overhead windows were looking at earth, and that always felt up, with the exception of that time where we went up and sort of did our upside down thing. And then we had a lot of fun with that for the next hour or two, just experiencing how nobody knew where anything was.
Yeah.
It took Pierre quite a long time to find the switch, because he had to think his way through, well, where is that switch relative to, this, that, and the other thing, instead of just going over and grabbing it. So a weird thing.
Yeah, I guess that's something you don't really, I guess people who've never been in space wouldn't really think about, but you have no real perception of up and down if you just reverse yourself. So
Right. And like I say, it was a fun thing to do. But yeah, food was, I think I ate less. We flew snacks, M&Ms, stuff like that.
yeah.
The only time I think we ever got those out was to play with them a little bit. And I kind of think it was because, again, with the exception of spacewalks, which are hard work, but in a very limited way, you just, yeah, you can exercise on the treadmill or whatever, but you're just not doing a lot of work. You're not walking around and, doing those kind of things. So consequently, you just, I think, don't have the same appetite.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. So you mentioned spacewalk several times now. So what was it like doing a spacewalk?
Yeah. So my second flight, what that mission was all about was, and it's a little bit of a long story, but we were getting ready to do the Hubble repair mission that was coming up. And it became very clear that Hubble was going to require at least 4 spacewalks, maybe 5. And it was also very clear to people that that was not going to work well with the sort of standard way of doing business, where one pair of astronauts would train to do spacewalks, to go out and close the doors if they didn't close right, or do something. And we only ever flew one, a pair of suits and 2 spacewalk trained astronauts, because the pressure suits for launch and entry don't work for doing a spacewalk. The spacesuit is basically a spaceship all by itself.
Yeah.
Has all the things you need to go outside. Pressure suit isn't that kind of a thing. So we only flew 2 spacesuits normally, but they're looking down the road saying, we're going to need to do a lot more than that. We don't want to discover, as we're training for Hubble, whatever problems we might discover, we want to discover them early. And they said, Intelsat would love for us to go repair this satellite that's stuck in the wrong orbit. So that's and they'll pay us to do it. So that's a very valid mission that has spacewalks involved. We also were beginning to evaluate what it was going to be like to build space station. We said, we don't really know how we're going to do this, but one version of building space station was going to involve an awful lot of spacewalks and assembling things by hand. And so they said, what we'll do, we'll put this mission together that the number one priority is to retrieve and rescue this satellite. And then we'll also do 2 more spacewalks. So we'll run through the whole cycle. We'll do 3 spacewalks, which means Team A goes out the first day, Team B goes out the next day, and then back to Team A the next day. So we'll cycle through the process of how you do that. We'll figure out how you carry 4 spacesuits, because the shuttle was only set up to carry 2. We'll figure out how you train 4 people in the water tank, sort of in same compressed time frame, getting ready for a mission, instead of just 2 people going through the training cycle. We'll go through all of those things on this pre-mission, where if something doesn't work right and we don't get to do the space station construction techniques, well, okay, that's not a huge thing. We can pick that up on another mission. So this mission was designed with those things in mind. It also happened to be the first flight of Endeavour, which of course was built to replace Challenger. And so, we had a lot of firsts going on that mission. The old joke being, do you really want to be the first folks to fly on this vehicle that was built by the lowest bidder? That sort of the standard joke going around. But of course, Endeavour flew flawlessly on that mission. But, so we're getting all ready to do this. And Pierre Thuot and I are going to be, what I call Team A, which is the 2 crew members to go do the satellite retrieve and rescue. And then Tom Akers and Kathy Thornton, we're going to be Team B to go out and do the first day of space station construction evaluation. And then Pierre and I would go out and do some similar things and some different things from them, but in that same category on the next spacewalk. Well, as it happened, the whole idea to grabbing the satellite was that it did not have a grapple fixture on it. So we couldn't use the robot arm to grab it. And so the engineers had designed and the technicians had built a device which was intended to latch onto the bottom ring of the satellite, where it normally would be attached to a solid rocket motor booster, to grab onto that, stabilize it. And then this big device that was grabbing the satellite itself had a grapple fixture on the end. So once we got it stabilized and grabbed, then Bruce Melnick, operating the big arm, would grab that grapple fixture, and he could now maneuver the thing around and over the payload bay. Part B to this was he would then lower it over a motor that we had brought with us, and Pierre and I would bolt it down onto this booster motor. And then the whole assembly would be released from the payload bay and go out, and then that motor would fire and raise it to the orbit it was supposed to be in. Well, in the simulators, this worked very, very, very well. And in fact, the first time I tried it, Pierre was primed for doing the grab with the capture with the capture bar. And I was his backup to do that. And I had a bunch of other jobs where I was primed. And of course, I tested doing it myself because I was his backup. And frankly, it was kind of easy. I was sort of not exactly disappointed, but sort of surprised the very first time I went to put the capture bar on, and we had a full mass 9,000-pound thing with the right dimensions floating around on an air-bearing floor at Johnson Space Center with smart motors driving all 3 degrees of freedom so that it would sense if we touched it, and the motors would drive it to tip like it should tip if we touched it in space.
Yeah.
And it was all very stable, and we got it every time. Well, cut to the chase, the first day, Pierre goes up to make the capture, goes right up against the satellite, touches it. Before the trigger can ever fire and grab this thing, it just goes drifting away from him. And now we're kind of in trouble because the satellite doesn't have the ability to stabilize itself in 3 degrees of freedom. The way it's stabilizing is that the flight controllers have got it spinning at a fairly low rate. If they had spinning too fast, we wouldn't be able to get the capture bar on. So they had to have it going pretty slow, but the problem is going slow, it's not very stable. So he touches it, drifts away. We tried several more times. He tried several more times to capture it. No luck. He couldn't get the thing captured that day. So we went back in. Of course, we were pretty, bummed out. And we were kibitzing with the ground and on board about, okay, what could possibly have gone wrong? Well, one of the things about that capture bar was it was very massive on one end and not on the other end. And so the thought was, well, because Pierre had never really been able to practice with that in space, was it causing him to not be able to go smoothly up and get underneath the satellite and get close enough to grab it without bumping it away? And maybe the fact that we were doing it, planning to do it in a certain lighting condition wasn't ideal. So we would change, we would do it in a different lighting setup. And I forget whether there was something else we were going to do different that day. So we went out the next day to do it again. And if you go back and watch the video tapes of it, you'll see Pierre come up. And by the way, he practices first along the side of the orbiter. So he's got this big capture bar and he practices approaching to the longeron and backing off and going forward. So until he gets it very comfortable that the mass is not an issue and he can be perfectly smooth. And so he gets his first capture attempt and he's putting the bar up and it's perfect. And you'll hear me start to say, I do believe, and I thought I was about to say he's got it. And then it tipped away from him. As of course, I didn't say anything else after that. So then we're like, oh boy, we tried some more times that day. No joy. So we were pretty discouraged at the end of the second day because really we had done it like we trained. We had tweaked everything. There were no new ideas. And so we were kind of down. And that night, I remember very clearly that most of my crewmates had gone to bed. I was still up because one of my duties was to go around the orbit. This was back in the days before digital cameras were really, we had a digital camera, one of the first, by the way. Digital cameras are in many ways a NASA spinoff because Kodak was helping invent them so that we could fly them. And this was the first mission where we had flown the electronic still camera and had the capability to actually downlink pictures that we took with it. We had flown it a couple missions before and brought back the digital pictures, but not been able to downlink them. Well, besides that, though, we had 16 millimeter film. We had videotape in 2 or 3 different formats. We had a Hasselblad large format camera. We had several Nikon cameras, 35 millimeter cameras. So every day at the end of the day, I'd go around collect all the film that had been shot up that day, stow it, deploy, new film to use the next day in every place. It always took me an hour to do that, even though it was supposed to be like a 10-minute job. So it took me forever. So I was floating around the flight deck, mid deck doing this. And Kevin Chilton, our pilot, was also up. And he says to me, "Hey, Rick, let's go brainstorm other ideas about how to do this." And I'm like, okay, in my head, I'm thinking, Chili, I know you're the pilot, you're pilot and commander flying the vehicle. You haven't been through all of the stuff that Pierre and I have been through for the past year, looking at every possible way to do this job. There is no other way to do this job. I mean, we'd even gone to the extent of, there were 6 satellites made like this particular one. The last one was being launched from South America, from Kourou. We actually got on an airplane with the flight capture bar, flew down to Kourou, Pierre in real spacesuit gloves, using the real capture bar, did a test with the last satellite in this series to verify that, we could make the capture. We had been on cranes. We had looked all over that satellite, thinking of where else could we grab it if we needed to grab it by hand. Where could the two of us grab it and stabilize it so we could get this capture bar? And there was nowhere. And so in my head, I'm thinking, Chili, no, there is no way. But, I love Chili. He's a great guy. He's a great friend. His heart's in the right place. And I'm thinking, no, Rick, you're not going to rain on this thing. We're going to go think through it, because if we don't do it after the mission, he's going to think, well, we should have really done that. And so we start floating around, looking out the window, looking at our payload bay. And all of a sudden, it occurs to us that pre-mission, you never would imagine using the pieces that you're going to use for space station construction to try and help with the Intelsat recovery, because for all 6 months before the flight, they might take that space station construction stuff off the mission and put something else on the mission. Right. So you don't mix your pieces. But hey, now we're up there. We got the pieces. Nobody's going to take them away. And it's clear what the priority is. The priority is to get the satellite. So if we mess up the process of building space station and practicing doing that by somehow misusing these pieces, nobody's going to care. They're going to love it. So we start thinking, well, what if you built a gantry somehow and that put Pierre in one place on the arm and Rick in another place on this gantry? And we're coming up with crazy stuff. And pretty soon, some of my crewmates who've gone to bed are floating up now. And I should say, meanwhile, the ground is saying, guys, go to bed. You're up way too late. And the way they could tell we were up is that we leave the computer up and running, or really the display that lets us talk to the computers. That's sort of their real cue that says, okay, they've really gone to bed. When they turn off the displays, they've gone to bed. So we're like, okay, they're going to nag us, tell us to go to bed. So let's turn off all the displays. So we turn off all the displays. So the ground's happy. We've gone to bed. Meanwhile, now my crewmates are starting to float back up to the flight deck, out of their sleeping bags. And pretty soon there's a bunch of us up there kibitzing and everybody's brainstorming. And then suddenly Bruce Melnick says, why don't we send 3 people out? I'm like, crap, yeah, why don't we? And then I actually said, heck yeah, why don't we all 4 go out? Well, that idea the 4 going out didn't work. We had 3 helmets.
Okay, yeah.
We have 4 spacesuits, but only 3 helmets, because helmets are all the same. They're all interchangeable.
Yeah,
so having 3 already gave us redundancy. Yeah. So we didn't need 4. Yeah. But it was like, and I will say with clear memory that at that moment when Bruce said that, I knew we were going to get the satellite. I had no idea how we were going to get the satellite, but I just knew that was going to open up the trade space for how you could do things so enormously that there had to be a way to do it with 3 people. And ultimately there was. We came up with some ideas. We then turned on the comm and called the ground and said, by the way, we didn't really go to bed yet, but we have this idea and we'd really like for you to look at it. And we had sketched it out and actually took a picture with this electronic still camera. We're going to, beam you down this picture we took of this idea, and we'd like you to think about it. And then we went to bed. And to their credit, they did think about it. It had never been done before. There'd never been a 3-person spacewalk. The system absolutely wasn't set up to do that. There's never been another 3-person spacewalk, by the way.
Hmm.
It's not that it was unsafe. It was that it had never been tested. And things, for
Yeah.
example, like your communication system. The way the comm worked for the orbiter, for a shuttle, was when you did a spacewalk, Pierre's got one frequency to talk on and 2 to listen on. So he could hear me and he could hear the orbiter. And I've got my 1 to talk on and 2 to listen on. And the orbiter's got its 1 to talk on and 2 to listen on. So we could have a conversation just like you and me. We could interrupt each other, talk over each other, just like you're sitting in a room together. Not so with 3 people, because there aren't enough frequencies for that. For 3 people, we had to go to what we call backup comm mode, where you flip the switch and we're all on the same frequency. Now, with all 3 of us plus the orbiter on the same frequency, now if I'm talking and you start talking, the other 2 people are just going to hear a loud screech. You're not going to know that you're stepping on me. I'm not going to know it, but nobody else is going to hear anything. So the comm has to go to the sort of military discipline of blah, 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 over. And then you stop talking, let the frequency release it, and let somebody else talk.
Yeah.
Well, that's great for the military trained guys. For Rick, the civilian, I'm not really trained very well for that. I did all right. I didn't step on people too much, but it's just one of many things that going out with 3 people makes very different. You're trying not to cross your safety lines to get them tangled. With 2 people, there's one of us on each side of the vehicle. Now with 3 people, where's the 3rd person? So a lot of things, but the ground sorted it all out. They came up with a procedure that was similar to ours, but different. And we had agreed, the crew on board, that whatever the ground sent up, we were going to do it exactly the way they said it. We weren't going to offer any new ideas. If they agreed to let us go do this thing, unless we thought it would be unsafe or just wouldn't work, even if we had a better idea, we weren't going to offer a better idea, because that would involve a whole nother day of them trying the better idea in the simulator and the water tank, checking it all out, and it just would take forever.
Yeah.
And we were starting to run out of consumables. We were starting to run out of the ability for Kathy and Tom to do at least one spacewalk doing station construction. And so we said, let's not do that. So we did it. We went out with 3 of us. We grabbed the satellite. There's plenty of video showing, what happened and how we did it and how it worked, but we got it kind of as planned. What we did was 3 of us, there were 3 hard points on the bottom of the satellite that you could, they were structural that you could grab. The reason Pierre and I had never considered doing that is because with 2 people, and it's a rotating thing, if you grab 2 legs of a rotating chair, it's going to tip one way or the other. You can't really stabilize it. But with 3 of us, each of us grabbing one leg of this tripod, we could get it very stable and then hold on to it while we sort of snap the capture bar in place and then tighten it down. And then Bruce could use the arm to move it down over the motor and do all the things we planned to do. And it worked great. We set a record also for the longest ever spacewalk. I think 8 hours and 29 minutes that lasted for about 10 years. Coincidentally, one of the guys that was in the water tank, being me, broke our record 10 years later by being outside for like 8 hours and 45 minutes or something like that, along with his spacewalking buddy, Susan Helms. But I think we're still in the books for the 2nd longest spacewalk, which is a pretty long time to be out there,
Yeah.
in a spacesuit. And we were in our suits for about 3 hours before we went out, and then 8 hours in the suit, 8.5. And then we were in them for about 45 minutes after. So we're in the suits for about, 13 hours or something. And
Jeez.
when people say something like, well, what if you have to go to the bathroom? Say, well, can you imagine going 13 hours without doing that? So we were the first flight to actually fly diapers in the spacesuit rather than the urine collection device going to a bladder, actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, by
Wow.
definition, we had some pretty wet diapers when we came in, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I mean, 8 hours, that seems like a long time to do a spacewalk. How dangerous are spacewalks in general?
That's a good question. I mean, you're obviously at a little more risk for a micrometeorite impact. I remember a funny thing, and I have no idea what the current insurance situation is, but we were all much more cognizant of the need for life insurance after Challenger. And as a government employee, you have a certain amount of insurance and you can buy a certain amount of additional insurance. If you wanted to buy on the open market another $1 million worth or something like that, which in those days was a huge amount of money, I remember that the number that was bandied about was it would cost you $10,000 to buy $1 million worth of life insurance if you weren't doing a spacewalk, and $14,000 if you were.
Yeah.
Some actuary somewhere made a calculation that it was 40% more dangerous to do a spacewalk than not. I have no idea what it really is. It's so much fun though. I got to tell you, the part I didn't say was when you first get out, you're kind of, the suit itself, the helmet's like wearing a ball cap. You really can't see up very well. You can see down really well, but of course your body and your spacesuit and all that are down. The awesome thing is a peripheral vision. The helmet comes around to here to where you basically can't really perceive the edges of your vision. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. If you turn your head, you're looking at the side of the helmet, but if you're looking forward, you now have this unblocked peripheral vision. And that is fundamentally different from looking out the window of the orbiter. I didn't know it was going to be that different. And so when I got all the things done to get myself over to the side of the orbiter on the first spacewalk and could grab the handrail and kind of turn my body and look toward Earth, I wanted to say something really profound. And I opened my mouth to say something and I realized, you're going to say, wow, this is really awesome, which is what everybody has always said.
Right.
So I just shut my mouth and didn't say anything because I couldn't think of anything to say that could come anywhere close to capturing the experience. Years later, as I was trying to describe it to people that would ask, I realized there is a way I can compare it. And that is, by now, most all of us have flown in a commercial airplane and looked out the window, and seen Earth or whatever through a little window. And most of us have either been on a tall building or on a mountain or a really high hill or something where you can stand there and see everything laid out around you. And it's that kind of difference, the difference between looking through your little porthole in the airplane and standing on a mountain. It's that difference between looking out the window of the orbiter and doing a spacewalk. It's just a totally different experience. And your heart wants to say this profound thing, and there's just anything you can say that really gets it until you sort of go through this description. And a lot of us, like I say, have stood on mountains, and so that's the right feel. It's that feel of being on a mountain. And so that part is awesome. You're 500 pounds of mass in a spacesuit. So, I'm 200 pounds. The suit's another 300. A lot of that 300 is in the backpack. And so when you maneuver around, you've gotten kind of good at maneuvering around in zero G, just you. But all of a sudden now you're outside in this spacesuit. It's very different. And so if you start pulling along, the water tank, you want to go from point A to point B, you grab a handrail, pull, because the water is slowing you down. When you want to stop, you sort of just stop pulling. Of course, in space, it's totally different. One tug and you're moving.
Yeah.
You don't have to tug anymore. And if you do tug some more, you're building up a lot of speed that sooner or later you're going to have to stop with this 500 pounds of mass. And you go to stop 500 pounds of mass and just grab the handrail. Whoa, you discover that your backpack has a lot of, inertia to it. And you might just, go zinging out to the end of your tether, which no one in the cockpit is going to appreciate because you're now a 500-pound, wrecking ball on the end of a tether flying around the orbiter, bouncing off of things.
Oh my gosh.
You really don't want to be that person. They might just, cut your tether and let you go. And they wouldn't do that. But no, nobody did it, and you wouldn't want to do it because
Right.
obviously there's a lot of things you can break
Yeah.
when you're a 500-pound wrecking ball on the end of a tether. So you learn very quickly to slow down, get a good grip, and then after a while you start getting more confidence and you move a little faster and do things more quickly. But yeah, there's a significant learning curve.
Is it creepy at all, like being on a spacewalk and then gazing out into the sort of the darkness of space? Or
For me, I didn't have that, but now one of my jobs was supposed to be on my last spacewalk to put my feet in a foot restraint on the end of the arm and be lifted up and grab another sort of like a satellite thing, pull it out of the payload bay and practice maneuvering around, see what maneuvering something like that would be in space with just my feet attached. I didn't get to do that. That would have been a good way for me to more experience what it'd be like to just not have anything to hold on to. You're just,
yeah.
your feet are. A friend of mine has described the experience of being on the end of the arm, and he was on station, Bigger station. He was supposed to transfer over to another thing with his hands, and he couldn't make himself let go. He couldn't make himself make that transition for about 15 minutes. His brain was just saying, no, we're not doing this. That's not a good idea.
Yeah.
I need to be holding on to something with my hands. And so I think different people have that experience of not so much that you feel like you're falling, because you don't, just that that if you drift off even an inch, you can't get back.
Yeah.
There's no amount of waving your arms and doing things is going to get you back. Yes, you have this tether, this safety tether. Your brain sort of knows about that, but not the old animal brain, the animal brain that holds on. It doesn't really believe in that cable at all. And it says,
Yeah.
you got it? I got it. Okay, next in. You got it? Yeah, I got it. So yeah, it takes a while, but it wasn't a creepy feeling. And I actually did a little sort of a Rick Hieb experiment on my first flight to check something out, because in the vast majority of my time on the ground, either in a digital sim or in a real full-scale mock-up of the payload bay, I had stood in the flight deck, looking out the back windows at the back of the orbiter, doing stuff with the arm or whatever, and it never seemed like it was very far to the back of the payload bay. And then prior to the mission, the orbiter was at KSC in the vertical, and we're doing a sharp edge inspection looking for things that could tear a suit. So they got these platforms stuck into the payload bay every 8 or 9 feet or something, so that we could reach in each level and feel around and check for any sharp edges. And at some point, I'm on the top platform right up near the back windows of the orbiter. And I'm looking down along the robot arm, which is now vertical, and I can see all the way to the bottom of the payload bay, kind of in that gap that's allowed around the arm so you don't bump it. I'm going, wow, the payload bay is really long.
Yeah.
Because it's 60 feet long.
Yeah.
That's 6 stories. If you stand on a 6-story building and look down, that's a really long ways, right? If you fall, you're going to splat. Whereas 60 feet horizontal, I can walk that in, a few seconds.
Right.
It was a completely different feeling. I thought, okay, this is cool. When I get up to space, what's it going to feel like? Is it going to feel like oh my God, look how far it is? Or is it going to feel like, it's just a few feet back there? And the answer is, it felt just like being in the horizontal, because you don't have a sense of falling. There's no fear of, I'm going to go splat against the other end of the payload bay. You're just going to float nicely back there.
Yeah.
So it's sort of my own little fun experiment.
Yeah. It's amazing just how different, the perception becomes in space of everything.
Yes.
And I guess the feeling of sort of drifting away in space because you have so many security measures isn't something I guess that concerns people much.
Not after the first few minutes anyway. Now,
Yeah.
by the way, on station, they have a device that we actually, we tested a bunch of things we knew wouldn't work for self-rescue on this particular mission, in fact, in order to help justify the development of something that would work. And so they took the old man maneuvering unit downsized it in many ways and developed a self-rescue capability. Because on station, you know, the shuttle, if somehow you fail to make your connection with your tether and you did drift off, well, the shuttle could fly after you and sort of scoop you up in the payload bay and
Okay.
rescue you. But on station, if that happens, obviously the station can't fly after you and rescue you.
Yeah.
And so they have this device that they wear on their suit. It's got basically a little handle you can pull out, which will activate some inertial measurement, you know, IMU or gyros or something to, first of all, stabilize. It has little thrusters on it, cold gas thrusters, fire gas to stop you if you're rotating. And then you can use the joystick to turn yourself back toward the space station and fly yourself back to station, rescue yourself. You know, it doesn't have a lot of delta V, a lot of velocity capability, but it's got enough that if somehow you just didn't make your tether connection, you could save yourself.
Wow. Be a great movie. That's have to.
Yeah, unlike the movie Gravity, which,
Right.
you know, there were no laws of physics that were not broken in that movie,
Yeah.
as far as I could
That's
tell.
what I heard. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Well, thinking now, I guess in the big picture, based on all of your experiences, what do you think is the future of space flight?
Well, you know, there's going to be a lot more travel in space. I do question the viability of any business plan that would involve a really big business in space right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are tourists out there with a lot of money, and it is getting cheaper to go fly in space. So there is a tourism business for a while, but is there a business, you know, other than tourism? You know, can you manufacture products in space that take advantage of zero G that would really pay off in the long run? I mean, like, for example, we did some free flow electrophoresis on one of my flights, and they did some on early shuttle flights. One of the problems with a lot of these things is by the time we fly something like that in space, it's super expensive. Meanwhile, somebody on the ground has invented a way to do it for, you know, $1.55 that doesn't require you to go into space to do it, you know, because people are really very creative. And so, you know, the business case for free flow electrophoresis in space was, boop, it was gone immediately when they invented gel electrophoresis. So a lot of the notions are kind of questionable because of still the cost of going to space.
Yeah.
If it gets cheap enough, great. But, you know, do I believe in it? I'm hopeful, you know, and I realize that Elon and others are talking about colonizing Mars. And I won't say that it makes no sense at all, but I will say this. How many people have been to Wyoming? A lot of
Yeah.
us have, right? Wyoming is gorgeous. Wyoming is beautiful. Nobody lives there. We haven't even colonized Wyoming, you know? Antarctica. Antarctica is brutal by Earth standards. Well, no, the worst day in Antarctica is better than the best day on Mars.
Yeah.
And we aren't colonizing Antarctica. Yeah, we do science there. And a lot of people are doing science down there. And I absolutely think we will do science on Mars, and there will be people on Mars. And that makes a heck of a lot of sense to me. But colonizing, I just don't know that that makes any sense today. Now, one of these days, maybe we'll have space elevators. And to me, that would change the entire paradigm of how costly it is to get to space. And,
Yeah.
you know, you can't really do engineering till the science supports the idea. But there are some notions that there are materials now, graphene and other things, that might be strong enough to actually consider weaving a cable that would be long enough to be a space elevator. You know, there's all kinds of problems with other satellites flying into the cable, and
Yeah.
you know, all kinds of crazy things that you're going to have to worry about. And who on earth is happy with the idea that what if the cable breaks and it's long enough to wrap around the Earth one time? You know, there's all kinds of those things, but at least the concept is one that isn't just totally science fiction anymore. Like, you know, faster than light travel, that's totally just science fiction. There's no physics that says that that's possible.
Right.
So, you know, I'm optimistic about a lot of travel into space over the next few decades. I don't know really what the business case is for manufacturing, but it might happen. People are, like I said, endlessly creative, and so I can hope for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's always so challenging just because people in general are, not necessarily built all that well for space travel in the first place. So I guess that's one of the reasons why we typically like to send, robots and stuff out there first, like Mars and other places.
Yeah, I mean Mars. What people don't fully appreciate, the moon. The moon
Yeah.
is really close.
Yeah.
Yeah, the moon is 3 days by spaceship,
Yeah.
3.5, something like that. I mean, it's actually, you can get back from the moon faster than you can get back from the South Pole in the wintertime. South Pole in the wintertime is closed for 8 months. We have people there.
Yeah.
But if you have a problem, you're not leaving there for months. There's been
Right.
exactly one time that somebody was extracted from the South Pole in the middle of the winter so far, once in history.
Jeez.
So you can come back from the moon in just a few days. Mars, on a sprint, it's 6 months. On a sort of home and transfer, lowest energy transfer, it's a year to get there. And then a year to get back, plus whatever time you spend there. All subjected to probably a zero-G environment coming and going, because a centrifuge is really out of the question for the foreseeable future just because of the weight of the thing. Trying to launch something like that to space is not going to happen in my lifetime. And so, we are going to send people to Mars in my lifetime. I have every hope of that, to do science, but it's not a safe thing. It's a risky thing to go do. I mean, we'll still
Yeah.
do it because humans are what we are.
Right. Yeah. Well, do you think that the privatization of space travel, do you think that has increased the potential for future space flights, or do you think it was better when it was just government projects?
Oh no, I don't love the fact that really rich guys maybe make more money off of space travel.
Yeah.
I don't love that fact, but I do absolutely believe that getting to space is easier, better, safe. I think it's safer, will happen more often because people like Elon and people like Bezos and others are spending their dollars on building vehicles to get to space. I hope and believe that there will be a disaster at some point involving people. I hope that we have the will as people to recognize that everything, whether it's ships or whatever, have the occasional bad thing happen, and you got to go figure out what it was and fix it and move on. And hopefully we don't go, oh, well, we got to stop doing all that because it's just not safe.
Right.
So I think it's been helpful. I love NASA, but because NASA is the government, they're compelled to be far safer than is really practical for space flight, over the long haul, I suppose.
Yeah.
Eventually, I think space travel will be safe. Flying on a commercial airliner is way safer than driving your car.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
We're way up there in the Six Sigma safety of airliners. Spaceships aren't there yet. Doesn't mean they can't get there. I believe they will get there. And I believe that competition helps us get there. So having the commercial guys out there, in some ways, a lot of what Elon has done has been with government money, after all. A lot of Elon's money, especially up front, has been US government money. He's got government contracts.
Yep.
The fundamental difference is the way the procurement is done. So as opposed to, say, Lockheed Martin building Orion, where the government is involved in every step of the way, very deeply involved, they're trying to move toward commercial buying practices where they have a lot of insight into what's going on in terms of the construction of the vehicle, but they aren't in there looking at every detail every day. They're buying a service instead. And a lot of people aren't aware that the government is actually required to buy a publicly available service if one is available. For example, to buy, paper for printers. The government is not allowed to go into business making paper for printers. They must buy it commercially because they can.
Yeah.
And that goes for everything. So as commercial space travel to station or whatever comes available, the government is required to buy that service. And so it'll happen. It'll happen. How fast? Who knows? But it'll happen, and I'm glad for it. Meanwhile, I hope the government continues to invest in the high risk things, like the first trip back to the moon, like taking people to Mars. Maybe Elon will do it first. If he does, more power to him. But it's the government that can take those sort of high risk things, and that's what they should do.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Well, last question for you then. What advice do you have for people out there that, are interested in becoming an astronaut one day like you?
So the first thing I'd say is make sure that what you do on your way to try and become an astronaut is something you really want to do. If you hate the idea of engineering, for example, it probably isn't really the right place to be. For quite a long time, I think, at least the professional astronaut, as opposed to a tourist of some kind,
Right.
is going to be someone who is, engineering minded, even if they're not an engineer. They might be a doctor, they might be any kind of scientist, but they're still the kind of person that, and by the way, what I'm trying to get at is also operationally intended. And my analogy that I give people when they ask about this is, when you go to your doctor because there's something going on in your body that you don't understand, or you're just going in for a physical, they poke around, they do tests, they do various kinds of analysis. If they have a question, they can order another test, and they can call in, some other specialist, a neurologist, whatever. A lot of kibitzing can happen. But then comes the day that you need surgery. Well, you go to the surgeon, they're working at speed. They're cutting, opening, doing stuff, fixing it, or deciding they can't fix and get out. I mean, it's bam, 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 bam. And what do we call that when you go in for surgery? We call it an operation. Well, spaceflight is all about mission operations. Once the engineering is done, astronauts are operators. They're not surgeons, but it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
You're in space, you can't go do a whole bunch of research before you go do the next thing. You're going to do what's planned for the mission, yada, yada. And so if you're somebody that, for example, hates to change a tire on your car, we better learn to change a tire on your car, because astronauts do blue collar work. It is a blue collar job in many ways. And if you would hate a job where you're going to get your hands dirty, where you're going to use a screwdriver, when you're going to, like happened on my mission, where my crewmate had to open up the aquatic chamber where a couple of salamanders had died, take out a bunch of tiny screws, lift the glass off, stick some tweezers in, and take these dead salamanders out, wrap them in foil and stick them in the freezer, and put this all back together. If the idea of doing something like that is just an awful thought to you, you don't want to be an astronaut.
Yeah.
You want to do something else. And in my interview group, back the first time I interviewed, we had a guy from JPL who interviewed with us and withdrew his application because he said, you know what? I don't want to do other people's science in space. I want to do my science. I'm more interested in my, scientific objectives as a guy at JPL than I am at going to be somebody else's blue collar guy doing stuff for him.
Yeah.
So he said, no, thanks. And of course, the other 19 of us in that group of 20 were like, yes, one less competitor. Yay.
Yeah, that's right.
Anybody else want out? Go.
Yeah.
But yeah, so first of all, I want to make sure that you understand that that's the job. And that, by the way, is part of what the interview week is about, is to have the applicants understand the job better. The other thing is, your odds are terrible no matter what. So you should be doing something you like to do. I loved working at Johnson Space Center as a flight operator. It was great fun for me. I was thinking that I would try to become a flight director next if I hadn't been selected to be an astronaut. Don't know if I'd have gotten selected, but I had goals and objectives that were within my path of career path. And going off to, getting selected to be an astronaut wasn't something that took me dramatically away from that. It was more of the same. So I would say, focus your time and energy on a career that you might love. And if you get the chance to go apply to be an astronaut, fantastic. But don't let that be the only thing in life that would make you happy, because
Right.
the odds are just too much against you.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Well, Rick, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about all your experiences. I mean, super fascinating. It's one of those things where I think for many people, you can't really understand what it's like to be in space without talking to someone who's done it. So it's really, really cool to get that information and just sort of try to experience through your stories what it was like. So
You're more than welcome. And I'll do one quick thing that I just realized we didn't talk
absolutely.
about. We didn't talk about landing.
Oh
So,
yes.
so for the space shuttle, very unlike anything else, space shuttle is a lifting body. So we came in like an airplane, and actually the whole entry was extremely smooth, extremely smooth. I never felt, there was one flight where we were pretty close to the ground where we had a little bit of turbulence, but
Yeah.
very little. It was, I mean, you're looking out the window, it's red hot out front. You see that and you know that it's a big deal, but it doesn't feel scary. It didn't feel scary. Now, people that come in on capsules, a little different experience, higher G, and especially the folks that have come in on a Soyuz on the sort of emergency return, where they get up to, they do a ballistic entry and they get up to something like 9 Gs. That's a very different, ball game from what I experienced on shuttle landings. But landings were, we were ignorant of the degree of risk that obviously was demonstrated on Columbia. If you have any kind of a hole in the leading edge of your wing,
Right.
we were ignorant of those things, sort of blessedly so, I suppose. I mean, you theoretically know, but it's different. Like I said about launch, it's different to theoretically know and then to have seen it happen and sort of feel it and live the risk.
Yeah, yeah, all those different factors at play, I guess. So,
Yeah,
well, yeah, thank you again. I really appreciate it. Definitely a cool thing. So,
you're welcome. And I'll look forward to hearing from when you have got something put together.